All right, welcome. Today, we're diving headfirst into a topic that has fascinated and honestly confused people for centuries: Bible prophecy. The common idea is that it's all just vague, mystical predictions that could mean pretty much anything. But the sources we're looking at today, they make a totally different claim. They say that at its core, Bible prophecy is actually a system of verifiable logic, maybe even mathematical precision. So is it just guesswork, or is there a logical code to unlock? Let's jump in and find out. First things first, let's just start with a universal truth, right? We are all fascinated by the future. It doesn't matter if it's a huge life event or just planning out our week. We're constantly on the lookout for signs and clues to tell us what's coming next. It really seems to be a fundamental part of how we're wired. And we do this every single day, if you think about it. We analyze the financial markets, trying to guess if our investments are going to go up or down. We track our personal health, from an ultrasound during a pregnancy to a doctor's prognosis. We're always looking for clues about what's ahead. We even follow world events, trying to piece together where everything is heading. We're all, in our own way, looking for a reliable forecast. And this brings us to the central claim we're digging into today. The source material argues that Bible prophecy isn't like your daily horoscope. No, it presents itself as something way more concrete, a system that's built on specific, measurable, and historically verifiable details. So, what exactly is the prophetic word? Well, the sources define it as a message that doesn't come from human guesswork, but from a divine source, revealing both God's purpose and what's going to happen in the future. And a really key part of this claim is that all these prophecies are supposedly tied together by one single central figure, Jesus Christ. Okay, let's get into our first major example, which the sources basically present as Exhibit A. And get this, it's not just a prediction, it's framed as a precise mathematical countdown to one of the most significant events in all of history. Here's the prophecy itself, right out of the book of Daniel. Now, notice the wording. It gives a super clear start point, the issuing of the word to restore and to rebuild Jerusalem, and a very clear end point, until Messiah the leader. And in between, a very specific timeline. 7 weeks, also 62 weeks. The sources argue this isn't vague at all. It's a direct countdown. So how do we get from weeks to years? Well, the sources point to a principle that's found elsewhere in these prophetic texts, where a day stands for a year. So a week then becomes a week of years, or 7 years. If you follow that logic, the 69 weeks mentioned in the prophecy add up to a total countdown of 483 years. So let's see how this clock plays out. Step 1 is the start point. The sources pinpoint this to the year 455 BCE, when King Artaxerxes of Persia gave the official order to rebuild Jerusalem. Step 2, we add the 483 years. And that brings us to step 3, the arrival. That calculation lands us, precisely, in the year 29 CE, the exact year that Jesus was baptized and began his public ministry. According to the sources, this is a stunningly accurate, verifiable fulfillment of the prophecy, right on schedule. Okay, let's move on to our next piece of evidence and see how this all builds. For Exhibit B, we're going to shift from a numerical countdown to a historical pattern. This prophecy, also from Daniel, claims to lay out a kind of map of world powers, one after the other from way back in ancient times, right up to our day. This prophecy comes from a dream about a giant statue made of all these different metals. And the interpretation, according to the source, is that each metal represents a dominant world power. In sequence, the head of gold was Babylon. It was followed by the silver chest, Medo-Persia. Then came the copper belly, Greece. Next up, the powerful legs of iron, representing the Roman Empire. And finally, the feet, made of a mix of iron and clay. And this brings us right up to the interpretation of that final stage. See, the prophecy doesn't describe another solid metal empire after Rome. Instead, it describes this weird mixture, iron and clay. The sources interpret this as the Anglo-American world power, incredibly strong and powerful, like iron, but also inherently fractured and divided, like clay. It's got elements of immense strength, but also internal social and political divisions that, just like the prophecy says, just don't stick together. But here's the crucial point. The dream doesn't end there. A stone, which the source says represents God's kingdom, suddenly appears and strikes the statue right on its feet of iron and clay, crushing the entire thing. This detail is key because it identifies the feet, this modern, powerful, yet divided entity, as the final human world power in this prophetic sequence. Okay, so we've looked at a mathematical countdown and a historical pattern, but why does any of this matter today? Let's pivot from the historical evidence to what the sources say is the personal relevance of these prophecies. The Apostle Peter described the prophetic word using this really powerful metaphor, a lamp shining in a dark place. The whole idea is that in a world that often feels confusing, dark, and totally unpredictable, these prophecies are meant to provide clarity, direction, and hope, guiding people until a final, clearer day dawns. So, based on all that, the sources highlight some specific future events to watch for. Think of them as signposts on the road ahead. First, a unique global declaration of peace and security. This is said to be followed by the sudden destruction of what the prophecy calls Babylon the Great, which sources interpret as the world's collective of false religion. Next, an attack on God's worshippers, referred to as the attack by Gog of Magog. And finally, these events are said to culminate in the final war of Armageddon. These are presented not as vague fears, but as a specific sequential checklist of events. So after examining these claims of mathematical countdowns and historical patterns, we're left with this one final thought from the sources. They present a case that prophecy isn't about gazing into a crystal ball, but about pattern recognition, connecting the dots from the past to the present and on into the future. And so they pose a question for all of us. When you look at the world, are you just watching the headlines, or are you watching for the signs?